Good. Well, hello, good evening, and welcome everybody to the first LGB Alliance Business Forum. My name's Dermot. I'm Dermot Kehoe, and I'm one of the trustees of the LGB Alliance, and I'm delighted to be your host this evening. I was going to say it's a very special day for me today. So today is my wedding anniversary. And I have to say, when Kate asked me to do this, it had slipped my mind. So I'm afraid I'm in the doghouse already. So we will be finishing promptly at 8 o'clock. I have a late reservation to get to. So we'll get through all the business. So without further ado, first I'd like to hand you over to our CEO, Kate Barker, and to tell us a little bit about the Business Forum.
Thanks, Dermot. I'm so sorry about poor Nigel as well about his furious. But anyway, well, any support services that we produce and that we create are really driven by the need. And ever since, right from the get-go for LGB Alliance, we've had tons and tons of correspondence about stuff that's going on in the workplace. And it's been everything from, as you'd expect, sort of pronouns and toilets. But there's been some really anguished communications from LGB people who feel really sincerely that our rights have been going backwards. And underpinning it all is this sense that expressing an idea in the workplace, however reasonably you express it, can have you labelled as being somebody essentially who is unkind if the person that you're directing it towards, or the group that you're directing it towards, disagree with it. And there's a sense that now in business that if you talk to somebody about something that they don't agree with, you might be making that person feel unsafe. And that was the kind of underpinning thought with lots of the communications that we received. And we felt it's such a pernicious idea, and it's really, really gripped businesses and kind of ushered in this sense that truth is something to be feared. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say there's an almost Stalin-esque sense that, if you say the wrong thing, you might be ratted out and sent to the career gulag. So, LGB Alliance, we're not very good at keeping quiet about things. So we wanted to start and think about how can we challenge that in a way that's going to be really good for businesses and good for LGB people. And bearing in mind as well, always noting that gay rights succeeded when we brought people with us, and that when we were sensitive to the needs and to the feelings of others. So that was the sort of starting point of the conversation. Those were the intentions, and then brought together all these brilliant people and lots of other people who've helped us. And now we've got an actual thing to talk about.
Good. Thank you, Kate. I was going to say, I think it's more Maoist than Stalinist, but that's probably a conversation for a different webinar. But we have gathered on the panel this evening the co-chairs and all the co-chairs of the forum. So I'm going to ask them all to start with a bit of a question about the forum, how it came to be. And then in the chat as well, please feel free to put your own questions. They may get answered before we get to them, but please put that in the chat. And if we can, we'll get to them a bit later. But Dan, if I can come to you first, you're a branding and PR expert with a master's in marketing and business. I know you've worked with some of the UK's biggest brands, including Virgin Trains and British Airways and like me, the NHS. Can you tell us from your perspective, what is the Business Forum and why is it needed?
Yeah, thanks, Dermot, much appreciated. And thanks to everyone who's joined us tonight. So we are a collective of senior executives from a range of sectors. We're all lesbian, we're all gay, or we're all bisexual, and we are concerned that our rights are at risk and that our voices in the workplace are being somehow diminished. Now, we know from experience that leaders have been given duff advice from consultants in inverted commas, or from companies who claim to be advocates for LGB rights and then haven't. So organisations have, with good intentions, worked with consultants or partners for advice that they thought was legally sound, but we're seeing more and more companies end up in tribunal for unfairly treating LGB staff or overlooking them for job promotions because that colleague has dared to say LGB is very different to the TQ+. Now, this is not a good look for a firm. It creates an ideologically charged environment for staff, and hostile environments are not good. They're not good for morale, they're not good for productivity, they're just not good. And I've worked in communications and branding for over 20 years now, and I've seen some companies avoid this trap well, and I've seen some companies who have got really savvy and switched on leaders, HR practitioners. But unfortunately, in my 2 decades of experience, I've also seen some leaders who haven't avoided this. They have, in fact, gone down this ideological rabbit hole. So where do businesses turn to if they want to avoid this? Where are the alternatives? And that's where the LGB Alliance Business Forum comes in. So the age of no debate, it's done, it's over, done that, wasn't great, thanks very much, it's done. And to steal a phrase from Simon Fanshawe, we want to promote safe spaces for diversity of thought in the workplace. The LGB Alliance Business Forum is about helping leaders to make really good, positive difference to LG people in their organisation, and to provide leaders with that alternative to what may have been previously that ideological capture. We also want to spark positive conversations with leaders who care about the rights of their LGB staff. Not only that, we also want to work with government, lawmakers, policymakers to give a voice to those businesses who want to do the right thing and appreciate that actually ideological capture is not the way forward.
Thanks, Dan. And I think recognizing that people are driven by doing the right thing is really important. I know in my workplace, when we had our indoctrination session, to make it very clear, I don't want to come into work to be called queer. I mean, it's just not acceptable, and it's not the law. And please don't do it. And they're all kind of a bit shocked by that, I have to say. But yes, I think working with it rather than thinking people are bad intent. Toby, you're a group HR director for a consumer goods brand based in London, and so you're very plugged into what senior leaders are saying and doing. How are you planning, following on from what Dan was saying, to get them on side rather than to antagonise?
Well, thank you, Dermot, and thank you to everyone who joined this evening. Really what we'd like to do, first of all, is we need to start some conversations here. There's a feeling amongst a lot of my network of senior HR professionals, CPOs, group HR directors, that they have lost control of this. And there's a little bit of embarrassment behind that. That's perfectly understandable. That's quite natural. I think a lot of people feel that they went into something with good intentions. They thought that by reaching out to supposedly reputable organizations, they were getting advice that was both legally sound and actually coherent for the organization. I think what they find now is that a lot of these groups and organizations, you've got very hardline TQ activists who tend to have taken a little bit more control than they should have done and act above their authority, let's just say. And so there's a little bit of embarrassment. I think that people have lost control of it, and they're trying to find a way to get back from there. So really what we want to be doing in the first instance is make sure that we're talking to senior leaders, especially those in HR and chief people officers, and just start with the conversation. Look, we understand how this could happen. We understand exactly what the thought process might have been at the time. But we want to work with you as we see some of these organizations losing their credibility for the advice they give. We want to be working with them and really showing them that there's a credible alternative to this. And really our message is, look, say if you're a FTSE 100 organization, you're going to have a substantial number of LGB staff. These staff can be one of your biggest assets. They're people who want to do well in your organization, to get remunerated well, build a successful career, and make a positive contribution to your business. Don't alienate that large section of your workforce. That's going to be a real message that we have there. In addition to those conversations, we'd also like to do a piece of research, and we have that underway at the moment. These will include some in-depth interviews, really just to understand what the the impact has been of some of these diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and understanding exactly how we might be able to offer a credible alternative in the advice that we're able to give. We're hoping to have a report on that ready in the early summer, and then we can take that to government, share with businesses as well. What we really want to do, first of all, is we want to make sure that people feel safe, relaxed, and able to have those conversations with us. We need to build a little bit of trust and credibility. We also want to get into the trade press, all those kind of areas, just to make sure that other voices are represented in this, and above all as well, speaking to MPs, ministers about what businesses need and what they want, and hopefully becoming a bit of a voice of representation there.
Thank you, Toby. Jenny, if I can come to you, and thank you for joining us. You're an organisational psychologist with global experience, and I know you're currently based in London and working in the banking, insurance and financial services sector. I didn't really introduce myself coming in, but I'm working in the insurance or indeed reinsurance sector, so I'm very interested to know what you have to say. So, but your part of your role is being in touch with current thinking on this. Did you think there's a danger that Business Forum can be merely seen as a war on woke? Effectively, will be reactionary or reactive rather than something constructive?
Yeah, thanks, Dermot. And that's a really good question. I think terms like woke can be quite unhelpful and a bit of an oversimplification of the issues at stake. So treating people fairly and making sure that a workforce is representative of its customers, making sure that it's considerate, building trust between people, all of those things should be at the heart of any HR activity. And so we're very wary of a knee-jerk reaction or rejection of everything EDI, because properly applied, EDI can be a really positive force for good. However, at the same time, we have to be courageous enough to point out that there can be a clash of rights. So as a psychologist working in business, my career has been focused on using psychology to help organisations improve the performance of individuals, teams, and the organisations as a whole. And what I've noticed from my own experience and from the lesbians and gay men in my business network, a lot of LGB people suffer when a formerly LGB network becomes LGBTQ+. So when this happens, the gay and lesbian members of the group who believe that sex is real are force teamed with people who think that gender expression is more important. So at the very best, the needs of LGB people are ignored, but these networks might include, for example, a man who imagines himself to be a lesbian. And I've seen, for example, many LGBTQ+ networks in Lesbian Visibility Week tell employees that they should celebrate men who imagine that they're lesbians. And the lesbians that I know experience this as highly oppressive. Why should we be, experiencing this in our workplace? So I think the question really is, how can we work with business leaders to unpick all of this in a way that feels fair to everybody? How can we ensure that everyone is heard? How do businesses create the right environment where everybody can feel that they belong and everybody is able to give their best professional performance, which is what all businesses really need? So, there are a few thoughts from me on that one, Dermot. I think you're on mute, Dermot.
Sorry about that. Yes, well, thank you, Jenny. I think it's very important to remember the value of DEI. I can remember as well before a lot of the sort of before there was any consideration to certainly lesbian, gay people in the workplace. We don't necessarily want to go back to that, or do find it just bizarre, some of these ideas you were talking about, like men imagining they're lesbians, which are really contentious ideas, and being coming into a workplace and being taught those, and when you wouldn't be taught, wouldn't be told economic facts as in quite the same sort of way. But I think your sort of pushback against woke, I think, is very apt. So if we come to you, Tim, I know you're retired now, but you have a 40-year career in design. that again began before LGB employment rights existed in the US. But as I'm sure as everyone knows, it's a big day today in the US. It's the inauguration of a new president. So whether for good or for ill, depending on your view on that, we're seeing some major changes going to be coming down the track. So Tim, could you give us a sort of brief overview of what you see are the issues playing out down the States and down the track, and what we can learn from there? We often say things happen in America first before they come here, unfortunately. So what's your take on what's happening?
Well, thank you, and it's a real honor to be a part of this group, certainly as the only person from the U.S. And it's been interesting, really, to sort of see how things play out in UK culture versus US culture. We mostly speak the same language, but oftentimes when you get down to the level of the law, we are even talking about different things sometimes. So even in my own friend group, I think I've had some challenging conversations with people since the election. There's a lot of people who are really scared that there's going to be this big rollback of LGB rights. And I'm a lot more hopeful than that. And what I thought I would talk about is really some of the fundamental differences between what our laws are based in and what yours are based in. And one case in particular that I don't think has gotten a lot of attention, but actually now even in the last day has, which is the Bostock versus Clayton County case in the Supreme Court in 2020 in the US, which was the first time that both protections for sexual orientation and gender identity were enshrined in US law. And the court found actually that rather than, I think you call them protected characteristics, we refer to suspect classes. So we have 5 suspect classes that date back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which are race, color, national origin, religion, and sex. And I think over the course of gay rights history, they've been trying to make case law around issues of sex stereotypes and things, and try to promote sexual orientation as a suspect class along with all these others. But what the court did was combine 3 cases that dealt with both sexual orientation and gender identity together. They like to take cases from different districts in the country where there are opposing opinions at the lower level courts before they take something on. So they took this case. There were 2 cases where long-term employees had been fired solely for their sexual orientation, and one was filed for their gender identity in the workplace. And rather than enshrine sexual orientation and gender identity as suspect classes, they actually found that the protection was based under the existing class of sex. And so basically they said, if a plaintiff who was fired for presenting female was discriminated against on the basis of his male sex. Like, you wouldn't fire a woman for presenting female. So you're firing this man because he's a man presenting female, not based on a gender identity. And in the same instance, in terms of sexual orientation, if you wouldn't fire a woman for marrying a man, you can't fire a man for marrying a man. So this was really groundbreaking interpretation that no one really expected. And it was actually the conservative court. It was in the last year of the first Trump administration. It was a 6-3 verdict. Now the court's a little bit different. If it were decided today, it might be 5-4. But it still seems that it's going to be around for a long time. And what happened after that, and what we're dealing with, and how all these ideas about gender identity is sex and preferred pronouns, all that infiltrated our workplace through executive orders and rules that the Biden administration interpreted this case from.
Tim, and the executive order we heard about today from Donald Trump on gender ideology, have you had a chance to look at that? How will that?
Yeah, basically, I think one of the good things about it, from what I've seen, at least from what was published by the Free Press, it really refers largely to gender identity. It really seems to use good language. And what you'll probably hear a lot of people saying, it's a war on trans. They're basically rolling back executive orders that the Biden administration had put in place. which are sort of extra legal. They're interpretations of the law. In areas of education, they're more coercive because schools need the federal money. And if you don't comply, that's why you see more cases of employment discrimination in the US based on coming out of education, where people don't want to use preferred pronouns or things like that, because schools feel compelled to do it. Other than federal employees, the rules that came out in terms of labor, they're not really binding on businesses. So I think, if you look at that original, under that original ruling, there's already cases that will be coming up through the courts. The good thing now, for the gender critical side, is that both the administration and the courts are on the side of sex realism. And if somebody brings a case today, say a man who identifies as a woman claims discrimination because he can't access the women's restroom, according to that case law, they'll look at it and say, well, you're a man, and all men cannot enter the women's restroom, so therefore you're not being discriminated against. So,
Thank you. Great, Tim. That's really helpful. We might come back to some of that. Actually, just before the next one, there is in the comments, which is one of my pet peeves. It says, I want people to be professional at work, not to bring their whole self. Whoever I mean, I don't bring... I bring my work self to work. You don't want the whole me. You can't handle whatever it is. It's like we all live in personas, and this idea that somehow, work is the place where you fully express all your. Seems a peculiar one to me. Anywho, enough of my pet peeves. Jemima, your background's in investment banking, first at Goldman Sachs and then at Credit Suisse, where you were diversity and inclusion manager. Where you backed up by psychological studies, you've delivered diversity initiatives in banking, insurance and consultancy. You've said before that you want to support a return to D&I that adds to a culture of openness and true inclusivity. So picking on from what I think Tim and Jenny have already said about not throwing out babies with bathwaters, if you, rolling back some of the worst of it, but we all believe in what's really important in there too. How can the people watching this tonight get involved in that?
Yeah, thank you, Dermot. Well, my passion has always been about employees and how they are supported at work and how they can enjoy what they do, because happy people do much better work. And to get to the nuts and bolts of what employees can do to support the Business Forum, we are asking people to sign up to become an ambassador. And all the information about what that means and how to do that is on the website. But just to fill in a little bit of it, as an ambassador, we would ask you to report back on what's really working in your organisation and maybe what's not, to be a voice on the ground, speaking for lesbian, gay and bisexual people who can, as we've already heard, feel uncomfortable with or silenced by some recent HR policies and practices. So feeding back might be in the form of a survey, or it might be asking you to supply an opinion piece for us to amplify. This will help us talk with authority to employers, to government, and to policymakers about the impact of current policies on culture and employee engagement. And if that sounds familiar, it might remind you of the great work of organisations like Stonewall prior to 2014. So as an ambassador, you'll be on our mailing list. You'll be invited to webinars and in-person events such as panel discussions, social and networking events. So this work could become a great way for you to build your network with other lesbian, gay and bisexual professionals. And being part of this initiative will help you feel supported at work and develop your confidence to speak out for yourself and for others who may be nervous to speak up when the policies and procedures are making them feel uncomfortable and excluded. So for a long time, diversity, equity and inclusion initiatives have impacted employees in ways that employers are often unaware of, and we really want to change that. So we are excited, talking of how you can get involved, that our next webinar will be an in conversation with Tess White. Now, if you haven't heard of Tess White, she's an MSP, she was an HR director in the oil and gas industry, and she's a lesbian. And so that's going to be one to look out for. And following that, we may look at holding an annual conference of our own. So please follow us on LinkedIn and follow up on our website, where we'll be posting lots of useful information on an ongoing basis. Yeah, thank you all very much for being here, and I look forward to seeing some of the questions that come up that we can answer.
Thank you, Jemima, and just remind people, if you do have any questions, please do put them into the comments. Toby, how has the Business Forum been received so far in your experience?
Well, with relief, considerable optimism, I think. People are crying out for a change. As I mentioned, that embarrassment factor earlier that a lot of people feel is quite real. And they're looking forward to the opportunity to talk through that with people who have been on a similar journey and understand the dynamic of that. They do want happy, engaged staff. As Jemima said, it's how people do their best work, and it's how people perform well for the organisation that they're a part of. And they're feeling desperately in need of a counterweight, for want of a better word. I think we also need to provide that support basis to really get some of the control back from the activists, maybe where they've taken a bit more of a role as well. And so we all have we're all sort of reasonably senior professionals here. We've all had experiences of very challenging workplace conflicts like that, professional dilemmas, those kind of things too. And so the feeling is that there's a lot of confidence, a lot of optimism, and really a lot of interest in talking to us. So I still think that's a really good sign. A lot of organizations are quite worried about having to make a humiliating backtrack. You know, they want to make sure that it can look reasonably professional, and they do want to arrive at a point where there's a sensible solution that doesn't involve losing face or things like that. So I think it's important. I think also a lot of organizations are starting to get worried about some reputational damage here. I mean, we've seen various calamities in terms of Wix, for instance, with the remarks that their CEO made following their appearances at Pride, and making very contentious statements of which, you know, a retailer that sells decorating equipment shouldn't really be getting involved with. We saw that with Bud Light, Jaguar, etc. So people are starting to watch this, and there's always a danger that maybe businesses won't put their power behind something that can actually benefit a lot of their staff. But really, that comes back to our core message. You know, you're going to employ a substantial number of LGB people. A lot of them are feeling very concerned about the dynamic of this at the minute. Please don't alienate your staff. Please work with us to make sure that you're actively representing their interests, and understanding that maybe the people that you've listened to in the past are very solely interested in TQ activism. It's not about the LGB. And so I think that's an important point there.
Thank you, Toby. One of the comments in the chat has been an example of somewhere where the Women's Network put up posters to get all the women to check their prostates. I'm paraphrasing, but not much. And people were silenced by this. Now, I confess, I haven't experienced some of the worst excesses of this. The example I can think, again, it was Pride Month. It was last year or the year before, and again, a well-meaning HR exec changed everyone's computer wallpaper to the progress flag. But as the communications director, I was able to come in and say, no, we've got to have our branding on here, and so on. So I obviously wasn't dealing with the issue direct on, but managed to address it that way. Does any of the co-chairs have any experience about how you can raise or when you see things like that happening, which clearly, you know, are not actually inclusive or actually exclusive of a number of people, how you might go about dealing with that?
I have a point, if I may, Dermot.
Yeah, please, Toby. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is important that people should feel empowered when they know that a contentious issue is being discussed. The first point of that is making clear that there's not one view on these things. I think it's the important thing to specify, first of all, and all workplaces and all businesses, in order to be successful and to actually achieve any goal that you have, you need to be able to have open dialogue and to be able to talk about these things freely. And so I think it's important, if you're not quite willing to go, and for various reasons that I think are very understandable, but the first step always is saying, you know, there's not only one view on these things. You know, what you've just said is contentious or it's disputed, I think it's always a good point just to say, if you can't go the full way, at least put it on the radar that it's not there's not only one view on these things.
Dermot, could I ask a question of the co-chairs that's sort of prompted by this, and also prompted, I have to say, by the sight of Trump today on stage with the village people in what is the gayest photos that I've ever seen. And yet he's very much accused of being kind of anti-LGBTQ plus community. And I'm just wondering what everybody around here thinks. Do leaders understand that people who are same-sex attracted may not necessarily have the same needs as people who are TQ plus? And I'm not suggesting either of those groups has needs that are greater. And in fact, by separating them out, people's needs can be addressed more specifically. But I'm just wondering what your sense is. Do people know, or are they like at Dermot's place where they put the progress flag up and they think, job done, fantastic, ticks all the boxes?
I'm happy to tackle that one first, Kate. I think it depends. It's very much, if you do have a savvy HR director or chief people officer, or you've got someone who makes it a point of being quite clued up on, the conversation of the day, then yes, they do get it. But one thing I would say in response to that is they tend to be in the minority. I would say the majority of leaders, the majority of HR practitioners know something's going on. They know this gay thing conversation's going on over there, or this women's rights, feminism thing is going on over there. And quite often they want to do the right thing, but they don't feel either confident enough to say or tackle it, or they simply don't feel like it's their place to say something because they're either not a woman or they're not gay. So quite often they will either outsource it to external agencies, they will outsource it to consultants, and I use the term consultant quite loosely, or they will outsource the thinking around it to internal network groups or internal affinity groups. Now, that has its pros and cons, but I think when you start to outsource your thinking on this to internal activists or external organizations who you think are acting in good faith and aren't, that's where you get into quite sticky situations. But I think on the whole, people don't know the ins and outs of this, but the ones who are particularly savvy, the HR practitioners who do stay up to speed with tribunals, do stay up to speed with the latest in employment law, they do know the minutiae and the detail of this, and they do encourage plurality of thought. They do stay up to speed with what it is to be gender critical. But I would say those good eggs, those savvy practitioners, are not the majority. The majority just think there's this gay debate or this women's debate going on, and they're going to outsource it to people who they think are in the know. And that's probably why we're in a bit of a sticky wicket to where we are today.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I mean, one of the questions coming is around data and data collection, and it's more difficult when we don't know if it's 5% or 55% of gay people who would say share our concerns. I mean, first of all, does it matter? Is it a numbers game, or is that not the point of diversity inclusion? Also, is this a gap that the Business Forum may look at? I know someone's talking about some research we're going to do earlier. Anyone want to pick up that one?
I mean, I could jump in a bit there, Dermot. I mean, I think the data gap is something that everybody's really, really concerned about. Then this is a wider question. This is about LGB Alliance. We find, for example, that we're now providing services in places where other organisations previously would have been able to, because they simply don't have the definitions and the data of what a lesbian or a gay man actually is, and they become fearful of addressing those directly. So it's just part of this whole kind of obscuring of the reality of what's going on, partly through fear, partly through ignorance, I think, and it makes truth really hard to pin down. And I just sometimes feel that that's almost that's done deliberately, where we could be much more open and honest and direct about it, and we could collect the data accurately across everything from NHS and workplace. There would be huge benefits for all, but we're going to come up against some resistance. And I also wanted to ask everybody, if that resistance to what we do is hostile, how should we tackle that? You know, I know this isn't going to be an entirely positive force, but it will encounter hostility. And how are leaders to manage that without there being chaos?
I could probably say something to that, Kate, if I may. Well, I think what you've got to look for is that we do need a little bit of empowerment on this. You know, I think the government, certainly in the UK, have been very both Conservative and Labour have been very weak on this in the past couple of years, and it's sown a lot of confusion, a lot of division, and there seems to be an endless slew of cases and various judgments coming out, and you know, all those things, you know, particularly the Forsyth ruling, etc. All of those, you know, great achievements and very important. It still doesn't necessarily give the clarity of what to do in this situation. I have every confidence that with the executive orders that newly elected Donald Trump signed today, I think that really, and with what he mentioned in his inauguration speech, I think it gives a little bit of a blueprint, and it puts these ideas into common parlance and makes them that little bit more. You know, we talk about these things a lot. We believe we're sincere in our in understanding what biological reality is, and a lot of us are here because we find the modern day trans ideology particularly homophobic in a lot of occasions, and we all have our concerns around that. But the more it is inserted into everyday parlance, and the more we can speak up, and the more people feel that there is some sort of rubric to follow, I think that will take a lot of the toxicity out of this and a lot of the fear of organizations in really tackling this issue and trying to understand it. And at the end of the day, we are not here advocating a radical view or something that is going to, you know, disadvantage a large swathe of an organization's population. Our message simply comes down to the fact that we're here to represent the interests of LGBT people, which will be a good percentage of your workforce, and you know, please work with us to understand how you can best support them and make sure their rights are upheld.
Thank you, Toby. A question from Catherine about an LGB business directory or an LGB quality mark. And Jemima, was it you that mentioned Stonewall, I think? I mean, this is obviously sort of territory Stonewall got into, and is imitation the sincerest form of flattery or whatever. I mean, I'm not saying tomorrow, but is that the right sort of route? What do you think?
Well, thank you. Interestingly, I was one of the team that put together the very first equality index with Stonewall. And working at Credit Suisse, embarrassingly, Credit Suisse came first or second in the first time it ran through, which they've kind of followed through with ever since. And we were embarrassed internally with that. I think other companies have just taken advantage of it, to be really cynical. But yes, there's no reason why we couldn't do that some way down the line. But you know, we'd need a few employees probably, and sponsorship, which is what Stonewall was so good at getting, sponsorship from organizations. And I'm confident that once we start talking to these managers and businesses, and they start seeing that what we want to do is to make things better for employees internally and therefore for their bottom line, I think we'll probably get some support to doing things like that. I'm quite excited about that question. So thank you, Catherine, for your question.
Fantastic, and thank you for your answer. Another question in the comments is Terry, seen in HR. As another organisation, it talks about there being far too much overreach from many HR teams. So something we'd recognise. The question's now there on the screen. Toby, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it's great to see seen in HR here this evening, and I would agree entirely. I think there has been a bit of a change in the dynamic of what today's modern day employee expects, and that there is this idea that in order for the company culture is becomes about people feeling happy all the time, and it's to do that, organizations have also tended to balloon quite a lot in their teams that look after corporate culture and diversity. And I think a lot of the times they've had to make a lot of work for themselves, which has involved a lot of data gathering, which in turn is used to then inform the organization's strategy. I think there is this belief that a lot of younger individuals in the workforce have this inherent knowledge of how things should be, and there does seem to be a bit of a pandering to it. You know, we often see the case, I think it was the case in Penguin Books, where where a young employee got up and said that I'm worried that publishing this book would upset my trans or non-binary friend, and there seems to be some form of credence given to that. I think there does need to be a bit of a resetting in terms of, look, you work for a company. The company is not your mother or father. You know, it's a place you go to earn your living, build your career, make a positive contribution to the business that you're working for, and in return you'll be financially compensated and win in that part too. So I would entirely agree, and I think certainly when we're looking to work with some of these HR directors and support them, it's definitely on our radar a little bit about how that power imbalance has tipped up a bit and how we might right that.
Good, thank you. Dan, there's a question in there from Jane about the forced start of judgment and the various other, and a lot of activity in this space in the UK has definitely been driven. I think, touched on the point earlier, perhaps because of the lack of leadership, maybe, or courage from the political class, has been led through court judgments, which I think is unusual in the UK. Tim, it might be much more of an American approach, my view anyway. But how important are those sort of judgments, and how important is it for HR teams to be aware of them?
Yeah, hugely. And thanks for your question and comments, Jane. We've got to give absolute credit to Maya because of her case and because of that ruling. Many subsequent tribunals were able to hang their hat off that. So we've got to give absolute credit to to the brilliance and the diligence and the hard work of Maya. And she's also gone on to set up a charity called Sex Matters, which many of you will be familiar with. But thanks to that, tribunal cases that are now being heard and won by those who hold gender critical views often cite Maya. So it's quite difficult to overstate the importance of Maya. In terms of, I suppose, flashpoints in the UK's public psyche, I think there's been a couple of moments in time where this ideological claptrap has really come to the surface. And yes, Maya is one of those. But when we look at some other occasions in the UK's in public life, I think they boil down to a couple of other instances. So, for example, in Scotland, when we saw the man, that is Isla Bryson, and we saw what happened there, and that Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP effectively were brought down by supporting the idea that a biological man who was a rapist and convicted could go into a women's prison. And when we then saw the images of this man in a blonde wig, in pink duffel coat and leggings, and we could see his bulge, let's not call a spade, let's call a spade a spade. We can see he was a man, and this man was going in potentially into a woman's prison. That really piqued the general public's interest, and there was a hell of a lot of noise around that. And organizations or newspaper outlets across the political spectrum really gravitated to this, because a picture really does paint 1,000 words. And that effectively led to what some people may consider the downfall of Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP. So that was a real flashpoint that really brought to the fore what this debate, this argument, this gay or women's right thing over there was about. And I think also we have to be thankful to Dr. Cass and the Cass report itself. Many people didn't really understand the ins and outs of it, but they also realised it was a big thing because so many people were talking about it across the political spectrum, and it was accepted by the Conservatives. It was eventually accepted by the Labour Party, not so much by some others in Scotland. But again, that was a moment in time where it really piqued the interest of the British public. And I think we have to be thankful for these occasions that really help to coalesce the public's thinking around what is effectively gender identity ideology.
Thanks, Dan. I mean, I do know as well that you've worked in the NHS at some point and the Business Forum, but often it's the public sector that's often seen as being the most dogmatic on some of these things, or perhaps the most captured. The recent case where the civil servant who won her case of being discriminated against because of her gender critical views. I mean, I know you're not a lawyer, but how significant is that? I mean, how porous is it between the public and private sectors in terms of these trends? Is that something you can talk to?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say, from kind of my observations and workings with numerous sectors, some of this ideology is particularly prevalent in the third sector, volunteer sector, because quite often the people who work in these sectors are of a particular activism ilk. Now, I know I appreciate that's a bit of a sweeping statement, but having been an independent advisor for Citizens Advice and also getting to grips with some of its, kind of, I suppose, sister organisations, you do tend to get sometimes a more activism mindset in these institutions. Whether that is the same for private sector, I don't know, and I'd welcome a thought or view from some of my colleagues on the call. But you do tend to see this percolating across pretty much everything nowadays, regardless whether it's fintech or education, health, aviation. Gender identity ideology has percolated and permeated pretty much everything. So I wouldn't say there is one particular sector that is immune, but there may be a view that actually the third sector and the voluntary sector, because of its activism ways at times, are potentially predisposed to it more so than others. But I don't think any one sector is particularly immune to this ideology and the ideological capture of its leaders.
Well, sorry, thanks, Dan. Thanks a lot. Tim, the States has come up a couple of times, and obviously it's a pivot moment and there's some change. Looking forward from where we are now and understanding as you do what's happening in America, what are the things we should be looking out for, both in terms of perhaps positive elements, but also things to be worried about?
Well, I'd say, echoing something that Dan said, in a Supreme Court hearing back in early December, which was about pediatric gender medicine, a number of the justices did reference the Cass review. So there is this, across the pond pollination happening. And I think, while of course it's not law in the US, it has been really influential. I think because of how the executive rules and decisions that were implemented really had more of an effect here in education and sports, those things have been really more the cases that were brought up and the things that are much bigger in the media. But a thread that runs through all of them really is this question of, which comes down to definitions, is this question of the protected class. So even in the Supreme Court hearing about pediatric gender medicine, which we'll have a ruling on by the end of June, was all about them arguing that trans kids were a protected class under the law. Now, there's no way that that's going to be considered true. But so I think we're, in the US at least, I think somebody alluded to it, we're much more litigious. We don't have I don't even quite understand what your judicial review system is, but I read about it. But we don't have that thing where someone can just go and say, can you evaluate, like the Free Speech Union can go and say, we want you to review this. It has to be an injury. It has to be an actual court case. So it could be years before even any of these new gender cases get to the level of the Supreme Court. So I think it is through, certainly there was another, if you look at our Congress, there was a very histrionic testimony among the Democrats about sports and things. again, we have 2 houses of government, so you got to pass both of them before something's even a law. So I think we're actually entering the phase where this is going to become part of the legal sphere. Like, I remember when gay marriage was being debated, and there were first all of these states had banned it, right? And then it got to the point where the courts started to have cases going through, and it became clear that this is where it was going to end up. And so that's why I feel really optimistic that the case law that we do have, that I referred to earlier, the Bostock case, and then in a week and a half ago, the guidelines from the government about education, which put pronouns in the workplace and men and women's toilets, that was struck down in federal court, and they basically said again the definitions in the statute of sex refers to male and female, and trying to redefine that as gender identity just turns the whole thing on its head, and you can't just make rules about that. So I think what's becoming more, and that's why I'm really interested in seeing how this executive order is written. If it really sticks to gender ideology, and it even hopefully using the word sex more, but if it sticks to gender identity, the more that people can understand the differences between these things, and that our conversation happens in the legal arena. All of the noise on X and YouTube is fun to watch, but unless we understand the differences between how rights are granted in different countries, it's hard to even really know what to think is going on.
Thanks, Tim. I think it's something that, sex and gender are different things, and I think if inclusion means anything, it's the and, not the but. So right. I don't know, but people do have different gender identities, fine, but that doesn't replace someone's sex. Or once you get clarity on some of that language, I think it becomes very straightforward. And if things are categorised on the basis of sex, then everyone does actually know what their sex is. But on that point, so I'd like to thank all the panellists for joining us and let me see some of the work that you're doing. It certainly feels like this is an idea whose time has come. I think it's meeting a need that's been there for some time. So good luck, everything you're doing. I look forward to seeing you go from strength to strength. Kate, anything you'd like to add in way of closing?
Well, just to echo what you said there, Dermot, and I think that's good news. It is about timing. I can't imagine us being able to have done this a year ago. So that in and of itself is really, really exciting. I just think it's so important to be able to facilitate discussion and that we can be open and honest in the workplace. We need to be able to legitimise debate again. No debate. And I think Dan said that, no debate is dead. We need to legitimise debate. Conversations are a good thing. They shouldn't be feared. And we need to have the ways and means to be able to develop new ideas that can take businesses forward, that are positive. And lastly, I think it's really important to know that we want to bring everyone with us.
So I'm on mute. Great. Thank you very, very much there, Kate. I'd like to thank our panellists, Jemima, Toby, Dan, Tim, and Jenny. I'd like to thank the audience for joining us and for your questions. And I'm sure I'm now going to be, I'm just extemporising now, but I'm sure there will be recording of this available on our LinkedIn and on our new websites and future events like this too. So thank you all very much, everyone. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Bye.
Bye.